Hi there. For this next exercise, what we'll be doing is we'll be talking about how to ink up our block and also how to kind of minimize the printing area that we're going to be using. So in this particular class, we're doing some TraceTransfer monotypes, and I've already peeled off the blue film from this plate. I just thought this one might be easier to see on the video, but anyway, I've got one peeled off already. It's a little bit too large for this paper to print easily, so I think what we'll do to make these beginning exercises a little bit easier is draw a rectangle that makes the printing area a little bit smaller. So what I've done is I've just traced a piece of manila envelope, and I'm going to do my best to kind of center it on here. You might take a little bit more time than I am to make sure it's really centered. And then what we'll do is trace with a Sharpie marker, or you could use a China marker. You might even be able to tape it off, but there's a chance that if you use masking tape, it might actually make it a little bit harder to roll out an even coat on there. So I think I'm just going to use a Sharpie marker instead. And this will actually become the back side of the plate. So once you've drawn that marker line on there, we'll be putting the plate face down as we're inking it so that we're not accidentally picking up any of this marker when we go to print it. And it protects the lines from getting rubbed away also. So the marker is on the back side of the plate instead of on the front side. And then we're going to keep the plate off to the side. The goal here is to ink only the center area here. We can extend out a little bit. What we'll be doing is masking out the extra ink area with scraps of paper, or you can use a paper towel or a piece of t-shirt and carefully wipe away any excess ink if you don't want to deal with doing the stencil method that I'll be showing you in a minute here. So another thing that may be helpful so that your plate's not slipping around as you're trying to roll across it is to use a little piece of non-skid underneath your plate. So I'll put that down. In fact, well, I'll put it here. It's just good practice not to be inking on your printing template anyway. So we'll slide this off to the side for a little bit while I'm showing you how to ink, and hopefully we've got enough room here that you can see. But again, I'm just putting my inked plate on this non-skid thing so that it's less likely to slip around while we're inking it up. You'll need some sort of roller. These are not super high quality rollers, but you know, they should work fine for these small plates. And you may also have an even smaller roller if we get to methods where you're redoing more selective inking. But we're just going to be inking that whole area, so I'm not too worried about it. The inks that we'll be using are Akua Intaglio inks. Now, Akua makes a monotype ink that's much, much runnier. You might find that in catalogs. Dick Blick is a good place to get ink if you run out of ink. These are just little sample sizes that I assembled with the primary colors. But if you ever need to order more, you can find it online. But look for the Akua Intaglio. It's a little bit more heavily pigmented. It's got a little bit more body to it, which means it's not quite so runny, and it spreads out easier on the plate for doing reductive techniques. So I prefer to actually use the Intaglio inks for monotype methods, although they do sell a separate runnier version that is called Monotype inks. So you might want to wear gloves for this if you don't like to get your hands dirty. You will end up getting ink, you know, under your cuticles and things like that. But if you can find some pretty closely fitting gloves, like nitrile gloves or latex gloves, or like the disposable gloves that you might get in a pharmacy, they're really easy to find. You can get usually boxes of 50 to 100 gloves, and try to find the size that fits your hand the best so that they're not too loose. You want to be able to have pretty good control with your fingertips. So we'll be scooping out just a small amount of ink. This ink is really, really heavily pigmented, and so it just takes a tiny bit, and we do want this to get you through the whole term. So err on the side of using a little less ink than you think you might need. This is a little plastic spatula. The other thing I like to use a lot are just little scraps of mat board that I've cut into little strips. This one might even be a little bit too big to fit into these containers, but often I'll cut little tiny strips that might just be, you know, an inch wide, so that I can pull a little bit out and not have to always be washing my spatula off. You also want to be really careful not to cross-contaminate ink. So like if you have the white ink or the yellow ink and you accidentally have a little bit of black on the edge of your palette knife and you stick it in there, you could contaminate the whole jar of ink. So always make sure you clean your spatula in between each color, or use an individual little scrap of matte board, or you might get a whole bunch of popsicle sticks or something like that that you can just use and throw away. But anyway, try not to contaminate the ink by mixing the colors accidentally. So I'm just going to put out a little bit to start with. You do want to kind of spread that ink out. Don't pour the ink out of the jars. As the weather gets warmer, the inks will get runnier. Don't pour them out or you end up with a huge mess. You got goop all over the sides there, and then it gets on the lid and on your hand. So always scoop out a little bit. It's fairly thick. And then you're going to be spreading it with the roller. Now, when you first do this, if you just roll out, roll back, what's going to happen is the ink just stays in the same spot on the roller and you never really get to spread it out. So what you need to do is lift it, and each time you lift it, pull it a little ways, or spread it out. And then you want it to be a similar thickness all over. So you don't want a big gloopy layer of ink. The roller should be turning, not just like slipping across it. So make sure you use a small amount. And again, I'm only going to focus on kind of inking in this area. It might be hard to see on top of this texture. So even though the non-skid is helpful, I think just for the video, I'm going to try to do it over here so you can see a little bit better about how much ink we're putting on there. So you're going to be going over it several times. The goal is to get a pretty even layer of black without overdoing it. You don't want to have it so greasy that you end up with an oil ring on your paper soaking out through the edges of your paper. So add a little more if you need to. This seems a little bit lean, so I'm going to spread out the ink a little bit more. And again, each time you go across it, lift up and put it down in a new spot so that the ink spreads across the roller. I'm using a pretty light touch so that the roller is really turning and not just slipping across the ink. So I'd like you to go a little bit outside of these guidelines, but don't go so far that you're dropping off the edge of the plate. So my plate ends right here where this black outline is, and you don't want to have ink all over the place. Once you drop off the edge of your block or your plate, then ink gets underneath the plate, it starts spreading everywhere, gets on your fingers, and it's hard to move the plate around without getting fingerprints on the edges of your image. So this way we have this little safety border, and it gives us a little bit more room to handle the plate without messing up the ink. So occasionally you might want to lift up the plate. Anytime you set your roller down, you'll want to set it on its back so that you're not setting ink down on all your stuff. And you can hold your plate up to the light, and you might see that it's even or uneven in some spots. So if you see lighter areas, you'll want to go back in and hit those areas with the roller a little bit more so that there's a pretty good coverage on the whole plate. So I notice this side's a little bit light. Alright, let's go ahead and try to print our first TraceTransfer. So I've taped down, in preparation for this video, I've already taped down a scrap piece of paper that's the same size as the washi paper that I'm going to be printing on. And I don't want this really messy border. So what we're going to do is either you can wipe it away. I'll do a little bit of wiping, and I'll also show you how to stencil if you prefer that method. But you could wrap a like a baby wipe around your finger and just carefully, try to wipe to that line. This is not super precise. It's not going to give you the same kind of perfect square image that you might get if you're using the stencil, but I'll try two edges just like that. And then let me grab a couple of scraps of, this is some newsprint that I've already cut ahead of time into little 1-inch strips. And you can actually zoom in on your image a little bit more if you want to make sure you get a really nice straight line. If it helps you to tape it down, you can, but usually it's not going to want to move around very much. So just do your best to get it nice and straight. If you can follow your permanent marker lines, that's great. You do want the corners nice and square. If you think you're ever going to be matting this print, it's going to make your life a lot easier to really make sure that these strips are on there nice and square. But you could always, if for some reason you get a crooked image, you could always trim it out and remount it on another piece of paper if you had to, but it's just extra work. So, so this way with the individual strips, there's a chance that your angles might not be perfectly 90-degree angles. Another solution that might make life even easier for you is to take a piece of freezer paper or even a clear sheet of, here I've got a sheet of like an overlay paper that you would run through a copy machine to make a transparency. And you could cut a little window out of this that's the same size as your image size. So if you cut a little, almost like window frame out of this real lightweight plastic, then you could also lay that over a kind of a sloppily inked plate to create a nice, crisp, perfectly square border for your print so that it looks a little more professional and doesn't have sloppy border. So those are just some options. Now for the trace transfer process we're going to try today, we're going to be using a super lightweight paper. Try to be really gentle with this paper. It wrinkles very easily. It's almost like tracing paper, but it's a pretty good quality Japanese paper. You might notice if you run the paper between your fingers really lightly that one side has a little bit more of a texture to it and the back side is smoother. So I usually like to put the smoother side down if you want nice crisp details, but if you want a little bit more texture in your print, then you could put the rougher side down. So for this one, maybe we'll try the rough side down. And once you touch it down to your registration paper, you're not going to be able to move it around because you're going to end up getting smudges on it and things like that. So do your best to try to square it up with our template the first time, and if it's not quite perfect, don't move it around once it's dropped down onto the paper. So I'm lining up the bottom edge first and then just gently dropping it down. Now anywhere my fingers touch this, I'm going to be transferring imagery. So you want to be pretty careful not to accidentally hold your fingers anywhere that you don't plan to have black spots in your drawing. It's safe to hold it out here since we don't have any ink in the outside part of our print. It's also safe to hold it where we've put these strips of paper because that can't transfer through to our print. This paper is also pretty fragile, so you don't want to be drawing directly on the back of it or you might accidentally rip it. So I would like you to create a little bit of a buffer layer. This is a piece of parchment paper, and I'm going to tape it right down to the, it's curling a little bit, so I want to flatten it out a little bit. So I think I'll just add a little bit of tape to kind of hold it into position. And I'll just tape it along one edge so that if I want to flip it out of the way, I can do that without having to remove a lot of tape, but hopefully this will just kind of hold it a little bit better. Okay, so with the pressure change, what you might want to do is start with some shapes that are really light pressure. I don't have a real idea here on a landscape or anything like that, but let's just try just the very lightest pressure with your fingertips, and we'll kind of peek and see how the progress is going as we do this. So let's just kind of like a super light pressure there. We can see if some of that tone is being picked up. It's really subtle there. Oh, it's moving around. I'm actually going to tape my print paper down too to make sure it doesn't shift. I thought the ink might be a little bit stickier and could hold it down, but I'm going to just make a little hinge here right onto my template so that the paper, I can peek at it without having it move around too much. So I'm going to press a little bit harder. Let's see if we can get a little bit more imagery showing up there. Yeah, starting to get a little bit of a speckle tone. So let's try to do a few little soft clouds, and the harder you press, the darker those values are going to come across. So I'm getting this kind of smoky atmosphere. As long as I'm just using my fingertips, I can press on the bare paper. I think as I start to use other tools, I will put the buffer paper back down. So we're starting to get some nice soft imagery there. if you had the ink on too heavy, then everything goes really black. So that might be a problem that you need to go back in and try a version with a little bit less ink if you find that you're... But let's go ahead and do some drawing here. So again, I don't really have a plan in mind. I'm just going to try to get a little bit more of a sense of a foreground and background. So I'm pressing pretty hard with this pencil. The more densely you draw those marks, then the darker the ink is going to transfer across. So again, I'll just kind of occasionally peek and show you how things are going. So you can see that where I drew with the pencil, it almost looks like I drew directly on the print with the pencil because it really has that character of like a charcoal pencil. But then there's some really beautiful soft areas as well. Now you can use some other tools. You know, you can try things like, let's try the wooden spoon. That's going to give a slightly broader mark perhaps than the pencil, although you can't really see where your marks go because it doesn't leave ink the way a graphite pencil will. But you can kind of see the image coming through there as well. But it's a little bit softer character of a line. And then let's try a few other tools that might be a little bit bigger tips. So let me find actually I'm going to just try the handle of this toothbrush too. We'll put in some rocks or some other things. And I'm using more of the side of this tool so that the marks are a little bit larger than they were with the pencil. Try to get some variety. And I'll go over this kind of tree shape again too. And I'm sort of rolling the handle of this little toothbrush as I go so that some areas might be fine lines and some might be a little bit wider, a little bit more calligraphic marks. So this paper is so thin that we can kind of see through as we're working and getting a little bit more character there. I'm going to try to get a little more of a mid-ground in here. It seems like there's sort of a foreground and not much else, so I want to try to add a little more atmospheric perspective. Maybe use your fingernail carefully. The goal is just not to rip the paper. So, you know, if you can add pressure lightly enough, I'm just using my fingernail here to create sort of a suggestion of leaves on this scrappy little tree. And you can kind of play around with this too and see what you can do. But what I'd prefer you to strive for is try to get some line weight variation so that you're not just making these kind of mechanical weight lines. If you do want some finer lines, you could try a finer tip pencil. So this is a really fine tip pencil. I'm trying to think where I want to have some little details, but maybe you have some little tiny plants or something, weeds. And so they might have a little bit finer line work than the big tree form. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and just pull this off so we can kind of see how things are going. So I'm taking off the buffer sheet and then carefully, now this paper is pretty delicate, so when you remove the artist tape you want to do it as gently as you can. If it seems like it's ripping the tape or ripping the paper, you might just sort of roll it off, but this paper is fairly strong despite how fine it is. And then you pull the print off. So I'll move this out of the way so we can take a look at the finished work and put a light color piece of paper under there so we can see it a little bit better. But so again, it's nothing very exciting, but what's kind of interesting is how speckled tone this is. So there's a little bit of tooth on this paper and it's picking up this dot tone, so it's almost like a lithograph in imagery. And then here's where I used the really fine tip mechanical pencil. It gave us a finer line here. This area I was just using a kind of blunt, just a regular school pencil. And then some of these areas to get the more painterly marks, I was just using my fingernail and dragging it along there. So I'd really like you to try to get 3 or 4 different levels of gray just through pressure variation and just strictly using your black ink. So that's one of the assignments to try is is getting value variation strictly through pressure changes. All right.